Session number 2 on Monday the 31st, dealing with hearing stream 9, which is hazardous substances and contamination. In the morning first session, we dealt with the 42A report and heard from Mr. Brown and Dr. Litchfield. We're now moving on to summary statement and issue number 2, Ms. Lincoln, paragraph 21.
So Mr. Daw, on behalf of Greater Wellington Regional Council, the original submission sought that reduced was added to objective 1. I initially rejected this submission as I didn't consider it was consistent with the strategic directions of the plan. In the submitted evidence, the response to the section 42, Mr. Daw seeks that minimise is added instead and states that this aligns with the policies 3, 4 and 5 and the regional policy statement, plan change 1. I agreed with this and recommended that minimise is added to objective 1.
Yes. Ms. Lincoln, this is a matter I'll take up with Dr. Daw when he presents this afternoon. The panel has some concern with the word minimise and the submission. Just wanted to confirm firstly that there was an original submission from GW on this.
Yes, on adding reduced.
Yes.
Yep.
And were there any further submissions in relation to the GW submission?
Please.
Appropriate.
Tokotoake, so EQC also submitted and further submitted on adding reduced, so they agreed.
They agreed.
Yes.
And the word was reduced, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the risk and consequence from natural hazards on people, property, infrastructure and the environment are reduced or not increased, so they wanted the.
The question I'll put to Dr. Daw is, does the word minimise take the relief further than reduced? Question I'll put to you is the term minimise defined in the proposed district plan?
Not.
Let's assume it is.
I don't think it is. No, I would have looked at that.
Dr. Daw helpfully indicated that the term is defined in plan change number 1. And that came through the hearings process on plan change number 1, and he says it is paragraph 23 that a definition of minimise has subsequently added through the submissions process to read reduced to the smallest amount reasonably practicable, and minimised, minimising and minimisation have the same meaning. And so the question that the panel will be putting to Dr. Daw and ultimately to you is the word minimise taking it's a policy, isn't it?
It's an objective.
Sorry, is it taking the objective further from reduction, which is an unspecified amount, through to minimisation, which is to the greatest extent or the lowest extent possible. So you'll need to hear what Dr. Daw has to say in response to that, but we think that there's a potential scope issue there, that the difference between reduced and minimised. Okay. Does that take us to issue 3?
Yes.
And yeah, and I think it's just the Fulton Hogan submission that's in contention.
Yes. Yes, that is in contention. I agreed with the addition from Kiwi Rail Holdings.
Yes. Just on the Kiwi Rail Holdings, is there a need for a definition of repair in the natural hazard chapter, or can we rely on the definition of that term in other parts of the plan?
I didn't think when doing this, I didn't think there was a need. I can consider that further again.
Yes, you've referenced that it has, or repair and maintenance is defined in the heritage
Mm.
and network utilities chapter also, but they may be bespoke definitions in relation to heritage and network utilities, but
The heritage one is bespoke, so that's in the definitions list at the start of the PP. The networks chapter, I don't recall.
okay. So the question we'll put to you is, does it need a definition? And if so, is there scope to do it? And if there is, what should the definition be? The 3 questions. It takes us on to section 4.4, which is the risk-based approach, and the only area of contention again is the issue about infrastructure we canvassed earlier. From Dr. Dorr, Greater Wellington. Okay, we'll come back to that with that submitted. And that takes us through to key issue 5, which is the actual fault hazard provisions and the mapping of those. And the key top paragraphs are 38 through to 43. And the 2 submitters that are going to appear this afternoon, Mr. Durling and Mr. Duncan. Take us through those, please.
So Mr. Hewison submitted on behalf of Mark Durling. His evidence included 2 reports regarding mapped earthquake fault traces near Featherston and states that they do not support the current mapping. The evidence states that they support the submission by Mr. Duncan for his site at Rangitamara. The relief sought is in this evidence, and Mr. Hewson, I assume, will elaborate on this during his session at the hearing. But based on the original submission from Mark Durling, he opposes the use of the fault hazard mapping in the PDP as he considers it to have errors.
Why do you say that the relief sought is unclear? You say the relief sought in his evidence is unclear. The relief sought should be defined by the submission. So what is the relief sought in the Durling submission?
Yeah, yes, the relief sought in the submission from Mr. Durling was that he opposes the use of the fault hazard mapping as he considered it to have substantial errors.
Fault hazard mapping for the fault avoidance zone or the fault for the FAZ or the FAA?
I believe it was for the overall fault hazard mapping.
In total or just for his property?
In total.
Okay.
It's my understanding, but he could clarify that.
Could we have a copy of his submission for this afternoon session, please? Physical copy, Ruth, please, for each of the panel members.
Of the original submission?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you. You were at paragraph 39.
Dr. Litchfield has provided expert evidence in response to this, which was attached to my summary statement.
Appendix 2.
The Litchfield clarifies, because it was queried whether bore log data was used, and she said it was not used in the GNS 2022 active fault study as it was not relevant to mapping fault active traces. And she clarified, while some field work was undertaken as part of the study, it's not logistically possible to check every fault trace. She disagreed with the statement that the work is not credible and does not recommend any changes as a result of the submitter's evidence.
Okay.
Based on this expert evidence, I consider the fault hazard mapping is based on the best available information, and I do not recommend any changes to that in my section 45 report.
Come to Dr. Litchfield in a moment, but why don't you deal with Mr. Duncan's submission too, and we can then hear from those.
Sure. In Mr. Duncan's evidence, he provided a copy of a fault hazard assessment at number 16 Kakaamu Road in Rangatamau by IRBA Consultants, dated February 2025. Again, it was just a report provided in this evidence, so it was not clear the relief sought, but going back to the original submission, he disagreed or I guess challenged the fault hazard mapping as well.
Yes, and again, in total.
I need to check that if it was in total, if it was actually just for the site, but I don't recall this site being raised in the section 42, so it must have been in total.
Again, Ruth, could we have a copy of Mr. Duncan's original submission?
Dr. Litchfield has reviewed the report provided and that submitted evidence for 16 Kakaamu Road and disagrees with the conclusions drawn, considering that the 2022 mapping and classification of the property is a possible active fault and stands by that is correct. And based on this advice from Dr. Litchfield, I do not recommend any changes to the fault hazard mapping for that address.
And just to complete the section, do you want paragraph 43 regarding the Gary Daniel property?
Alice Blackwell, on behalf of Gary Daniel, provided evidence that states they're generally supportive of the recommended changes outlined in section 42A report as they relate to the original submission of Mr. Daniel. This includes amending the fault hazard maps with respect to 125 Te Ore Ore Road, supporters note.
Wes, can you just give me the paragraph references in your 42A to the annual mission? Because presumably the paragraph 43 is an update to that.
Yes, so in paragraph 320 of the 42A report.
It's amazing. I had that open.
Mr. Daniel sought deletion or amendment of the fault hazard overlay extent across this property, and they provided a geotechnical assessment. Dr. Litchfield reviewed that assessment and recommends that the fault hazard area is revised as such. So
it's a 42A recommendation then? Yes. Okay. Okay, that's good. Thank you for that. Dr. Litchfield, three submitters there that you've commented on, two of them in your addendum and one underpinning the 42A. I don't want you to read your addendum, but are there any particular, the panel may have some questions of you, at any particular point, and I have one question of you, any the points you want to draw our attention to on those three?
I guess just in summary, the specific properties, I mean, obviously I looked at them in more detail when I was preparing this evidence, and the reports that just commissioned a desktop study looking at the same data, I just disagree with it because I, re-looked at the data and stood by my original interpretations. But if they'd done some ground investigations like trenching, then yes, I modified the zone. So I just wanted to distinguish between sort of two types of consultant reports that were supplied.
The obvious question, and I'm putting my devil's advocate cap on here, is submitters might say to you, well, Dr. Litchfield, your study has been based on a desktop study also. Isn't that a bit rich that you're criticising them for doing a desktop study when effectively yours been a desktop study supplemented by some ground truthing?
Yes, okay, fair. I guess what I would say is ours was a regional study and faults extend for kilometres. And so in the case of one of the Andrew Duncan property, it's very clear there's a fault to the south and to the north of the property. So it seems reasonable to assume that it continues across it. So it's that kind of thing. I think there's just a difference in approach when you look at just an individual property and look at some traces. Then it is hard to tell if it's a fault or not. But if you have that bigger picture view of things, it can.
Well, since you mentioned the Duncan property and you've said it's very clear to you based on the LiDAR data, what about the Gerling property?
That's the Featherston trace. So in both cases, actually, they're both called possible faults. So none of this is really definitive. Again, ground investigations or something would be needed to distinguish that. But there were several reasons that I thought that the interpretation stood. One of them is that, again, that sort of wider view, we actually mapped what we call a fold, which is not, the fault hasn't quite broken the surface, but the ground is deformed to the north and south of the fault trace, which wasn't available in our 22 report because we didn't include folds in that report. So that was information they were unaware of. And then when I did detailed profiles of the LiDAR data across that property, across the fault, you could see some clear features that said that it's more likely that it was a fault to do with what the ground looked like on either side of the fault that couldn't be explained by alluvial fans and things that they were proposing.
Talking about the Girling property here, aren't you?
I am, yes.
Yes. Did you do the detailed LiDAR investigation for the Duncan property also?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Okay. What's the difference between the outcome? Well, the Daniel property is one that where has been a change. What's the reason for that?
So in that case, they did some trenches. They dug some trenches in the ground and demonstrate that there was no evidence of fault in those. And so in that case, we brought the fault avoidance zone in beyond the position of the trenches.
You were happy with the robustness of that information that was provided on behalf of the submitter?
Yep.
Can you recall who did that work?
It was Ian Brown
It was
Associates.
Ian Brown.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, Brian.
The Andrew Duncan property at Kakahumu, as that assessment was done by IRBA, do they use the same sort of technique of trenching? They're doing a desktop.
The report that for the Andrew Duncan property was just a desktop study.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it used the same data.
No physical trenching or anything. Yeah.
So was it? Sorry.
They have information, access to the LiDAR data as well?
They used the LiDAR data, yes. They said it in its report, and geologic data, and basically the same information we had. Yeah.
Same information, different result.
Yeah, no, Brad just answered it for me. Yeah. Well, asked it for me.
So is it possible that if both Duncan and Girling had done some trenching, that there might have been a similar outcome to the Daniel property?
Yes, the zone could have been narrowed or maybe even taken away if it's demonstrated that it's not a fault trace.
Difficult. How difficult is it to undertake the trenching?
It's logistically quite easy to do. It's just a digger.
Yes.
Sometimes it's challenging to get the right geological or soil layers in there to be really definitive. You can dig a trench and then not be sure. So that is true. There are other techniques as well. You can use seismics or penetrating radar, geophysical techniques that you use as well.
On that, David, if they do trenching, who do they get in to assess it? Do they trenches?
Usually a geological consultant. So Ian Brown Associates, they do trenching. Yeah.
So there'd be a contractor engaged to do the trenching and then a professional to interpret the results.
Usually they just get the contractor to do that.
Yes.
They can get us to do it, but we don't review all the reports.
Yes.
No.
Okay. And would there need to be an established methodology for the trenching? And is there guidance on that anywhere?
No, there's not. No, we have often done a sort of an overview of these studies and provided that guidance for people.
But Mr. Brown, obviously, were you satisfied with the methodology or the extent and location of trenching?
Yes, they're quite experienced. They've been doing trenches for a long time on Wellington region faults.
Okay. So if that information came in prior to the panel making a decision on the Duncan and Girling properties, you'd be able to review that information and make a recommendation?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we might suggest that to the Yep. Okay. Is it, I guess it's weather dependent too, isn't it?
Can be. Yeah. Yeah. Not too bad in the Wairarapa.
How extensive are the faults across those two properties in a linear sense? Do you
They go right across.
give me an idea? Are we talking hundreds of meters, or are we at the kilometers?
You're talking about the width?
No,
No, the length, but it depends on the size of the property.
yes,
It's went right across it. Yeah.
presumably,
No, it's hundreds of meters, I think.
yes.
Yeah, it's
So-
not, they're not really big properties.
It'd be a matter of taking samples along the length.
I think if you dug a trench across the whole, what we've mapped as the fault avoidance zone in one place, that would be okay. You don't have to do it multiple times everywhere.
We might question Mr. Brown on that later this afternoon.
So just to clarify that again, so yes, but it would be a continuous fault line. It wouldn't be just a fragmented line.
Well, the Dueling property, the Featherston one, we've just mapped a single line. The Duncan property, I think we've mapped two that is just slightly off.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
it's not really complicated.
So single trace and dueling, and
Two traces on the Duncan property.
that's been really useful, and hopefully the two submitters, when they present this afternoon, might take some confidence from that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Anything else, Pam, on? Okay, so where are we?
That's at page 9.
That take us to 4.6, page 8. Flooding.
Yes.
Okay, again, it's the side development one. That is the one in contention, I think. Dealing with the flood hazard overlay. Brookside development site. It's going to take us through paragraphs 48 and 49
Sure.
and 50.
Mr. Ian McComb has provided evidence on behalf of Brookside Developments Featherston Limited. It states that the flood hazard overlay is not based on the best available flood information for Featherston. The evidence explains that specific flood modelling has been undertaken for the development in a Tonkin and Taylor report dated May 2022. They consider this to be the best available information about flooding in the current state of the site. The flood hazard overlay maps in the PDP are based on flood hazard maps from Greater Wellington Regional Council. Mr. Andy Brown from Greater Wellington Regional Council provided expert evidence in response to the submissions made to flood hazards for the Section 2 British report.
Yes.
Mr. Brown recognised that there is a desire and need to update the flood hazard mapping for the Featherston community and explains that this is currently being undertaken and forecast to be available for mid-2025. It is assumed that the site-specific information provided by the submitter will be considered as part of this detailed flood hazard mapping when it's developed. Until this flood hazard mapping information is available, I recommend using the current flood hazard mapping provided by Greater Wellington Regional Council.
Thank you. Mr. Brown.
What's your confidence in these maps being available by mid-2025?
Yeah, very high confidence in them being available. We completed the community engagement on calibration over the last couple of weeks, so that has all been done and there's no major flaws that's been identified through that process. So now we're on to essentially finalising the model, completing the final peer review and making the mapping available. So it's very close to being ready. So yeah, high confidence of it being ready in mid-2025 as stated in our evidence.
So that's May it will be available, or July?
So we are tracking towards May.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Brown, have you had a chance to look at the Tonkin and Taylor reports 1 and 2 that are referenced in this submitter's evidence?
I haven't, but I understand that our flood advisory engineers have been through them and have seen them and obviously been involved in the process when they
Yes.
were developed at the time.
Yes, one was a 2022 report. I think one was a 2023 report, and that, it sounds like that was submitted as part of a subdivision consent. I've got some questions about that. I don't know who's in the best position to answer those. Russell, this is in your patch, isn't it? The Brookside developments, has that subdivision consent been granted?
It's final conditions. There's been several parts to it, so final condition being conveyed to the applicant at the moment, so that interplay is happening at the moment.
Yes. Would we be able to get a copy of the subdivision application plan for this afternoon before
Scheme plan,
we have it? Could we have that on the for this afternoon?
Yes.
I've read overnight the legal submission from Mr. Thompson, who's from Fletcher Vautier Moore in Richmond. He's representing Brookside Developments,
Okay.
and he's basically, well, it's a very clear set of legal submissions, which isn't always the case from lawyers. Essentially, he's saying that they're not seeking any change to the policy or rules. They're seeking a change to the flood alert overlay area, or the flood vulnerability overlay area. He talks about the yellow and orange areas, and he's saying that the TNT modelling of the site is fit for purpose and should inform the spatial extent. And that's why I put the question to you, Mr. Brown. Had you seen the reports? And if you've said your flood engineers have probably seen them and presumably they've been involved in this application. Russell, can you confirm that? Have Greater Wellington been involved in the subdivision? Russell, could you do that for this afternoon? Yes. Are you aware, Mr. Brown, whether Greater Wellington took an active part in the consent?
I believe we did, and I believe we have gone through worked with the applicant and the engineers on their submission, and we do take into account to that.
Yeah.
Site-specific flood hazard assessments when we do provide our advice to territorial authorities on subdivisions.
Yep. Okay. Well, cutting to the chase, what the panel's of a mind to do is to direct some conferencing between yourself and your team, Mr. Brown, and the submitters, experts from Tonkin and Taylor. Just as as a bespoke exercise separate to the work that you're delivering in May/June 2025, to see whether you can get an agreement on the spatial delineation of the hazard areas. It seems to, that's sort of what the submission's asking for. We're of a mind to enable that.
Yep.
And this is a situation where someone's made the effort, albeit through a consent, to do some ground truthing and modelling to decide whether the flood alert areas are actually appropriate or not. So this would normally be what the process envisaged with the restricted discretionary activity status for habitable dwellings. Here we've got a working example right in the middle of our decision making. So what more could we ask for? And Mr. Brown, are you happy to be involved in that with your team?
Yeah, absolutely. I could put that to the team who are going through that final modelling for us at the moment and make sure they've taken into account. And yes, we can discuss with Tonkin and Taylor as well.
Yeah, and we will we'll set the parameters for that in terms of a written direction, and we'll talk to Mr. McFerm about that when he presents this afternoon. All right, on that basis, unless there's any, I think we can move on.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the flood hazard ones. Sorry, paragraph 52, there's an issue, and I think, Bronte?
Yes, I'm just reading that. '52, there's no contention against agreeing with the approach, but 53 was paragraph 53. Mr. Dorr recommend renaming of hard stand areas to impervious surfaces to match other provisions, which I agreed with. So that was just a change in terminology.
Okay, that's good. That takes us then to issue 7, liquefaction. So just in context, this is a situation where of the 3 areas, it's just the last area that's mapped and has policies and rules associated with it. That's the possible liquefaction.
Possible liquefaction. Yeah.
Right. Well, take us from 56, if you like, on that.
Michael Hewson's provided evidence on behalf of Mark Juling and included a number of documents, including notes, sort of an overall notes page, and then a number of assessments, including appending the GNS reports, which informed the mapping that is available, as well as some site-specific reports, and a letter from Ian Brown to the CEO of South Wairarapa District Council on liquefaction hazards in the district.
Generally.
And I guess, challenging the mapping. So this was prior to proposed district plan. It was about, I guess, what was available for building consent.
Yeah, so these reports are all 2020 or earlier. Yes.
Again, the relief, so I guess in the notes from Michael Hewson weren't immediately clear, but based on the submission from Mr. Juling, he opposes the inclusion of liquefaction hazard mapping in total in the proposed district plan. And my response to that is the liquefaction hazard mapping is based on the Wairarapa District's liquefaction vulnerability assessment by Tonkin and Taylor that was done specifically for the proposed district plan. As outlined in the Section 33 report and Section 42A report, this assessment was specifically commissioned and it followed the Ministry for Business Innovation, Employment's planning and engineering guidance for potentially liquefaction prone land. So it was done based on that standard. Mr. Hewson's evidence references the building consent process for undertaking liquefaction assessments. And I've provided some context in terms of what happens under the building code based on the revised B1AS1 standard, which ensures new buildings are built safe and strong to withstand liquefaction effects. This change was made as a result of the experience through the Canterbury earthquakes. The rules mean that robust foundations are required for liquefaction-prone ground, and councils were advised to undertake hazard mapping and identify liquefaction hazard areas using that MB guidance. And I provided a graphic there which just explains the building consent, I guess, process. South Wairarapa District Council have confirmed that the building consent officers rely on the current liquefaction hazard mapping on the local maps liquefaction mapping on their website. This is based on data from the GNS 2018 report. This is different to the PDP mapping, which was done based on the 2022 mapping because it hasn't become, operative yet. Once that PDP mapping is operative, the building consent officers would use this new PDP mapping as it is more up to date. Mr. Hewson's evidence does give rise to the query of the necessity and appropriateness to include liquefaction hazard mapping and provisions in the district plan, or whether it's appropriate to rely on the building consent process.
So we'll have a question from Amelia Lukens on that in a moment.
The building consent process ensures appropriate foundations are used in liquefaction hazard areas, but it does not control land use activities in liquefaction hazard areas, and in this way it is appropriate for the district plan to control land use in liquefaction prone areas. There are other districts in the Wellington region in their approach to liquefaction. The proposed Porirua district plan does not include liquefaction hazards in the district plan. The proposed Wellington City District Plan allows for all activities in liquefaction hazard overlays as a permitted activity except emergency service facilities. And the proposed Lower Hutt District Plan allows for additions to new buildings for everything except childcare service activities, retirement village, education facility, emergency services facilities, or healthcare activities. So those more vulnerable activities. Based on the information presented in evidence and considering the above, I acknowledge there may be differences in the findings of site-specific assessments and the district-wide assessment on liquefaction risks, recognising the different scales and information relied on. The approach of triggering a site-specific assessment is consistent with the national guidance for managing liquefaction risks. And at this time, in response to the pre-circulated evidence, I recommend retaining the liquefaction hazard mapping in the PDP. However, in response to the pre-circulated evidence, I consider the costs of requiring site-specific assessment through the provisions of the proposed district plan for residential activities is duplicating the requirements and costs imposed by the building consent process. So to avoid this duplication, I recommend amending Rule R7 to permit residential activities within a low hazard area, specifically possible liquefaction prone areas. I consider the building consent process is likely to achieve the same overall outcome in terms of mitigation, so foundational building design based on that liquefaction risk. I recommend maintaining the restricted discretionary activity status for activities which are more vulnerable to hazards, which is due to the number of people or the type of use. And this approach is similar to the proposed Lower Hutt District Plan. So that would be hazard sensitive activities excluding residential activities. While the building consent process would ensure appropriate building design for these activities, these hazard sensitive activities are likely to be used by more people, potentially more vulnerable than individual residential properties. It's also important that during a liquefaction event, accessibility, so arriving to or leaving a site for these more vulnerable activities is provided for, and these could be affected by liquefaction and is therefore important to consider in a resource consent process. I've recommended changes to those rules to reflect.
Was that the old Rule 9, was it?
Yes.
Okay, so panel, that's on page 18 of the Index 1, which was the revised recommended changes attached to the summary statement. Okay, so I see what you've done there. You've added in a new permitted activity status for residential activities in a possible liquefaction zone. And you made it clear that RDA is for it's for non-residential activities
Yes.
located in it. So what did Rule 9 used to, there's no black text there. What did Rule 9 used to say?
There is no black text. You're right. That must be an error.
Presumably,
Go back to the 42.
were there any permitted activities in the Rule 9? Did everything trigger to the status restricted discretionary?
They've defaulted to discretionary. That was the only black text.
Oh,
Because everything is hazard sensitive and it's in moderate and hazard areas. So moderate and low hazard areas.
oh,
So I introduced more of a risk-based hierarchy into that.
which is different from the flood alert areas, isn't it? Because the default there is RDA, isn't it? Whereas the default on default on hazard sensitive activities in a moderate or low was going to be discretionary, which automatically raised the question, in my mind at least, that didn't the rule need to be more nuanced than that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd recommended, in section 48, bringing that.
RDA and discretionary. Just to give the panel some confidence, what's the policy guidance on old Rule 9, new Rule 7? Policy we're looking at.
Sensitive and moderate is so it's activities in moderate hazard areas, which is policy 3, activities in low areas.
Hang on, I've got to go. You're 42A for that, don't I? 3, did you say?
Yeah, so that's anything in moderate hazard, and then
Allow sensitive activities with moderate hazard. Okay, if they anticipate an assessment being undertaken in the same way that the flood alert area requires a flood hazard assessment?
I think so, because it's to, where it incorporates mitigation measures that demonstrate that any damage is going to be low. So whilst it doesn't say commission report,
No.
I think to prove that, you would need to make sure that you have a expert saying.
Sure. But given now, so rule, let's call it rule 7 is dealing with moderate and low hazard areas. Policy P3 is the moderate. Where's the low? Oh, P4.
P4 is low.
Provide for. Okay, so provide for you. So you're providing for residential activities and as a permitted activity, and under P4 and Rule 7, and for moderate ones, you're only allowing those hazardous sensitive activities as a discretionary activity.
Yes.
So where's the policy for clause 2 of Rule 7?
Discretionary.
Yeah, restricted discretionary. Is that still P3?
Yes.
So you're saying P3 deals with subclause 2 and 3 of Rule 7?
Yes.
Okay. Not that clear to me. The rationale for that,
Yeah, I can look into that.
would you?
Yep.
That'd be good. And the scope for this? Scope for all this?
Yes.
How do we come across?
Action.
Yeah, so this is Mr. Durling's. Okay, so Mr. Durling would provide some scope if we weren't to delete the liquefaction mapping layer over his property or over the entire district, but modify the policy and rule framework in the way that you've suggested.
Because I think that the outcomes of the building consent process achieves, if you're going to, I guess, mitigate against foundation design,
Yep.
structure integrity of that building, if the requirement for that in the district plan is the same, you're achieving the same outcome.
Yes, so the focus on the district plan is on the activity, not so much the building.
Yeah.
Which brings us to Ms. Lucan. So you're currently using, what was the terminology? Relying on the current liquefaction hazard mapping on the local maps, liquefaction risk.
That one and the Wellington seismic hazard.
Okay, yes. But you would use the mapping in the proposed plan once it becomes operative.
Yes.
Yes. The liquefaction mapping, well, none of the hazard mapping had immediate legal effect, did it?
I don't think so.
That's possibly a change that the government's looking at with the RMA reform.
Yes,
Yes.
I think because it happened before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why you're not using that, I understand. Typically, Ms. Lucan, what's the typical outcome where you've got a building consent for a habitable dwelling or any other building that's within the local maps or the MFE mapping? What's the typical outcome? Is it building consents approved with conditions, or are we seeing building consents declined?
Section is not considered a natural hazard under the Building Act. So we treat that slightly differently. We have considerations to make under the Building Code B1 as the compliance pathway. So we must deem a site to not be subject to lateral spread.
Okay.
There are the 3 tiers to the maps: low, moderate, high. If you have what is considered an IL1 building, importance level 1 building, which is a garage, a shed, it doesn't have any structural stability requirements. It's not a habitable space. We would just take some ground testing. Anything a habitable space that's in moderate and above, we require a geotechnical report, as we need evidential basis to determine that the ground is not.
What's the terminology? Is it an IL2 or something?
Yeah, so
IL2. And typically, have there any IL2s been declined? No.
And so we generally wouldn't decline a building consent application for that or refuse it. What we would do is they would have to propose a suitable foundation design for ground type.
Okay. Yes. Okay. And then the district plan would look at the suitability of the activity that might be housed in that building. Okay, understood. Okay. Yeah, okay. Did T&T undertake any assessment of the dueling property?
Don't know. Understand. Are you referring to the report that was commissioned?
Yeah, it was more of a regional or district.
The regional scale report done in 2022. So, and I haven't had any engagement with Tonkin Taylor since coming on board with this process.
But there's two, in addition to the fault hazard concerns of Mr. Durling and Mr. Duncan, they both have liquefaction overlay concern. Whereas who was the other submitter? Daniel seemed to raise liquefaction concerns.
Yep.
Okay. One of the things the panel will need to discuss is whether we ask for Tonkin and Taylor to assess the information that's been supplied by Mr. Durling and Mr. Duncan in the same way that Dr. Litchfield has done for the flooding information on properties that she looked at. We'll just keep that in mind. That's a Charles, that's a potential. Okay, just conscious of time, panel.
No, fine.
Okay, we're sort of, you might want to take us to paragraph 67, which just for the record with Mr. Duncan, as Mr. Duncan was in the room this morning.
There you go.
Okay.
So Mr. Duncan provided a liquefaction assessment report dated June 2022 for a dwelling on Glenmorgan Road.
Is that his property?
I'm not sure if he owns that property. Based on the submission from Mr. Duncan, he opposes the inclusion of the mapping, and again, it's assumed it's in total, not just for that property. For the reasons outlined above, yeah, I agree that I haven't changed my recommendation.
Okay. Again, same thing. We might just we might do a direction on that. But could you this afternoon? Could you just find out? Could you just tell us what the address from the Duncan property is? Colleagues that the Glenmorgan Road one is not his property. He was probably providing that as information to to make the point about liquefaction.
So what is your question to me?
Question is, what is the street address for Mr. Duncan's property? We don't think it is.
Kako, it's Kakaumu Road.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
For its
You're
own-
right.
For its own property.
Yes. Yep. If you could just double, for the record, provide us with his address from the simplest way is just to provide us a copy of his submission notice. Original submission, Ruth.
I wouldn't have,
S59.
I wouldn't have thought Glenmorgan Road was
No.
a liquefaction problem.
No, and that's probably the point that Mr. Duncan's making.
Yeah.
Okay, nearly there, I think, before we hear from the next presenter. I think, just take us through the key matters and contention then, your paragraph 71.
Based on the matters raised in submissions and the pre-circulated expert evidence, I consider the following matters to remain in contention. So whether the fault hazards should be included in the hazard risk category. So that's the bringing them back into the high, moderate, low.
And you've shown those as recheck changes in your 42A. Yes.
Whether to use the flood alert / vulnerability area overlay that applies to the South Wairarapa.
Total or on individual properties?
Well, I guess it's still in contention in total.
Yes.
The matters are still challenging it. The location and extent of fault, flood and liquefaction hazard areas as they relate to some specific properties. The activity status for activities in high fault hazard areas. So we haven't talked about that.
We talked about that.
We haven't talked about that today, but it was a change I made in the section 42A report. That was in response to some submission points.
We do need to talk about that.
Should we talk about that? Yep.
So what's the policy and rule?
So the rule is old rule 8, new rule old rule 10, new rule 8,
Yes.
where
We're looking at 42A or your summary for that.
42A.
So rule 10 is the page 11 panel on the.
You're looking at appendix, okay.
Oh, yes, that's it. No, I'm looking at the updated one, aren't I? I go back to,
It'll be the same.
it'll be the same.
Yeah.
The second to last page.
So the rule is any hazard sensitive or potentially hazard sensitive activity and associated buildings within high hazard areas. So we're talking sort of the high
Yeah.
matrix. The notified version was a non-complying activity status. I introduced a discretionary activity status or potentially hazard sensitive activity. So bringing in that, I guess, hierarchy, saying if you're potentially hazard sensitive, so in the middle, and you're in a high hazard, then you could be discretionary rather than non-complying.
Where did? Sorry, got some paper here. Just trying to find your summary statement. Can't even blame my colleagues for stealing it. It's. No, it's right in front of me. How does that work in terms of your table 1 or page 2 statement then?
So table, so we're talking potentially hazard sensitive down the first column. And then high hazard area.
Yes, but you've said the only non-complying activity in the notified version was for river corridors.
Yes, that's correct, because faults weren't included in the risk-based approach.
Okay, so when they come in, so when faults are added on the risk base, what are they? Do they trigger to non-complying also in the high hazard?
I've recommended that there's a clause, so discretionary, if a technical report is provided, if you're in a high fault hazard area.
That's based on occurrence, isn't it? No, what's that based on? What's the red text that you've added for fault?
So
Both between the hot, low, medium and high.
yes, so recurrence interval and fault complexity. Yeah. So if it's in a high fault hazard area, so because more known about the fault, then if you provide a technical report demonstrating that the activity you're doing is located out at least 20 meters away from the identified fault trace, i.e. not right bang on the fault trace,
Yeah.
then you can be a discretionary activity.
Take me to the changes that you brought the faults back into. What rule are we dealing with?
So in the introduction to the chapter, the faults are now in the definitions of that high, moderate, low, and in the rules, the corresponding, I guess, low, moderate rules apply. So I'm still looking at rule 10, old rule 10, new rule 8.
Okay, so just taking R3, permitted where you're not in a fault hazard area. That's the new change. R4, if you're in a moderate hazard area, you're restricted discretionary.
Yes.
And then do we jump to R810? Is that the next?
Yes, that's the next rule. Well, 9.
Not old 9, new 7.
9U7 is for hazard sensitive and moderate or low. So if you're in a moderate or low fault, those also apply.
Seems to be jumping around a bit. Gone from 3 to 4 to 7. 4 was things with.
That's just additions to buildings. Yeah, it's like a standalone.
Okay, so that's buildings.
Yeah.
I need to see this in a table here. Assuming that your red text for the fault does come back in.
Yeah.
What's the wiring?
The wire.
The wiring, the linkages between the policy and the rules.
Right. Okay. I'll put this in the table. But yeah, activities in high hazard areas. So policy 2, to reflect the change in that rule 10/8, I added a clause in policy 2 saying
Activity is appropriate
under policy 7, which was sort of the old fault hazard policy, which means that there's a pathway, I guess, for that discretionary status rather than non-complying.
Okay. But without those changes, old rule 10 subclause 2 was dealing with any hazardous sensitive activity potentially and in a high hazard area, which would have included faults as a non-complying activity.
If faults are adopted into the risk-based approach, but if there was no clause for discretionary, then it would be non-complying. Yes.
Okay. And so they would, under the new rule R8, old 10, they now become a discretionary activity so long as there's a report.
Yes.
And where that report is not provided and it's within a flood hazard corridor, or it's in a flood hazard kit. Flood hazard. Sorry, okay, it's non-compliant, which, okay, I understand. Going back to the table then, page 2, then river corridor and high fault hazards would have been a non-compliant.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you're suggesting a more slight relaxation of the rules with consenting pathway based on DA with policy relief.
Yes.
What's the scope for that? Who asked for that?
I think there's scope because we're reintroducing the fault hazard areas, which numerous submitters asked for,
Okay.
and then amending the rules and policies accordingly.
You cover that off then in your right of reply that which submitters asked for fault hazard rules to come in, be reintroduced, and satisfy us that the change to the activity status and policy is consequential within that scope.
Mhm.
Are you getting that, Charles? Yep. Good. Sorry, panel, I've dominated.
No.
Yeah. This is a very important topic. So, unlike any of the other topics, this is dealing with risks.
Yep.
We're dealing with effects and all the other chapters. Mental shift required. You were just going through the matters in contention.
The last one being, infrastructure, whether to include it as a levy.
Up to door. Yep. Very good. Thank you so much. Any final questions?
No.
Charles, any clarifications along the way with questions put, or we deal with that at the end of the day?
At this stage, I think we're all clear, but I'll run through those stuff.
Thank you. Okay, as they say, come on up. Come on down.
Yeah.
Changed it all? I don't need it. I love that. That's otherwise.
Extent.
Actually, I will take one.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to shut up now and other people can ask
You did
questions.
it right, David.
It's important to do it.
Yeah.
Following along.
Good. Good. Thank you for that. Right. Well, fortunately for you, I'm not as prepared on this as I was on the hazards one. All my colleagues will step up to the mark. Questions, but what one are you going to deal with first?
We'll go with contaminated land.
Okay. Want to start with paragraph 4.
So overview of contaminated land. Under the operative district plan, the contaminated land chapter contains a single objective, policies and rules relating to the redevelopment of contaminated land, as well as an appendix containing a list of contaminated sites. Since the time the ODP was prepared, the National Environmental Standard for Assessing and Managing Contaminants in Soil to Protect Human Health, the NESCS, was introduced. The NESCS provides a nationally consistent set of planning controls and soil contaminant values as a framework to identify and manage the use of contaminated soils that are likely or more than likely to have an effect on human health. In Section 4 of the NESCS, it's noted that these regulations deal with territorial authority functions under Section 31 of the Resource Management Act. Territorial authorities therefore process and make decisions on resource consents applied for under the NESCS. As the ODP was prepared prior to the NESCS being introduced, it did not contain any objectives or policy guidance for the consideration of consents triggered under the NESCS. As the ODP and NESCS do not integrate with one another, it resulted in the doubling up of consents where a rule was triggered under the ODP and separately under the NESCS, and inconsistency where rules were not consistent with or reflective of the NES.
The district plan's a chance to review, a chance to get it right. Right, they're wrong.
When looking at the status quo approach of retaining the existing plan objectives and policies, it was found that they partly addressed the identified resource management issues, but the scope and wording was less aligned with the NES. The analysis further identified that the NES manages risks that protect human health, not the wider environment, and that discharges are addressed in regional plans. Under the proposed district plan, contaminated land chapter only contains objectives and policies instead of setting out a separate separate rules within the chapter or paraphrasing the NES. It was considered more appropriate for the chapter to refer back to the regulations under the NES. Overall, this alternative approach to provisions, being an objective, policies, and reference to the NES regulations as the rules, was considered the most appropriate option. This is because the regulations of the NES are already effective in regulating activities on or within contaminated land, and including objective and policy direction in the PDP provides that helpful link between the two documents when processing resource consents made under the NES. For me to continue? Or?
So the theme there is that not introducing any new rules per se, but providing a policy and objective framework to complement
Yes.
the NES.
Yeah. Right. So a total of 17 original submission points were received on the contaminated land topic and 1 further submission. Of the submissions, 12 were supported specific provisions, 3 supported in part and 2 opposed in part. 1 submission was received on definitions relating to contaminated land. I have read the respective evidence of Thomas Trevilla on behalf of BP Oil New Zealand, Rebecca Eng on behalf of Transpower New Zealand, and Helen Cayley on behalf of Fulton Hogan Limited. I acknowledge both Mr. Trevilla and Ms. Eng are happy with the recommendations outlined in the Section 42A report. Ms. Cayley for Fulton Hogan has sought an amendment to Objective CL01 and Policy CLP2, which remains a key matter in contention. So I respond to this below. Ms. Cayley has claimed in the evidence that the notified wording of CL01 misses a crucial aspect of the NES, stating that it does not link the level of human health protection to the intended use. They have therefore provided alternative wording which they believe will better link the level of human health protection to the intended use as follows. Contaminated land is identified and managed so that human health is protected in the context of its intended use. I consider the alternative wording provided does not make the objective more useful or achievable. The current wording reflects the purpose of the NES and safe for human health, and its intended use are inherently linked and would be read and applied together. I therefore recommend the original wording be retained. In regard to CLP2, Ms. Cayley's opinion is that the policy unnecessarily repeats CL01 and has requested the following amendment. Would you like me to read that?
No, it's a similar vein, isn't it?
Yeah.
With paragraph 16.
I consider the reference to ensure it's safe for human health in policy CLP2 is effective and efficient as it directly links to achieving the objective of CL01. Deleting these words would make the policy less effective as it would not be explicitly clear the purpose of managing subdivision, change or use. I therefore recommend the original wording proposed be retained.
Okay, and I think you could probably leave it there because that remains the one matter of contention, isn't it? Thank you for that.
Can I
Any questions?
just like a bit of a clarification on why you have decided that the word site should be replaced with land? Just to expand that out a bit, because site is very specific, whereas land is very generalistic.
So I think it just reflects the NESCS. So they talk about contaminated land. So I'm just keeping it consistent rather than it being interchange with site and land and it making it a bit more confusing. So there's not much more than that, just consistency.
Okay.
Can I follow that up?
Yeah.
So, and have you had any experience in processing NES consents?
Yes.
So if you've got a large site, but a small proportion of that site has land which is contaminated.
Yeah.
But the activity that's been proposed doesn't intersect with that land that is contaminated, Was the NES triggered?
No.
So that's the difference between site and land.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll talk about it in a little.
Yep. But that's, okay.
Yeah.
That's my understanding of the way it's been
Yes, and
administered around the country too.
yes, and piece of land is defined in the NES as well.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
All good.
I got one, David.
Yeah.
Wondering, there's been a bit of discussion around the word human health as opposed to human use.
Yes. So
What are your views on? I mean, it's going to be used by humans, whether you define it as health or use.
So I guess the ultimate goal is that it's safe for human health. Rather than
I see
use.
you've added in there,
Yeah.
or it's an intended use too.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think. So if we got a consent under the NESS, the intended end use might be maybe for a reserve, something. So that's the intended end use. Human health, that would be looking at what the parameters are set for what's considered safe for human health. So it's different between reserves or if it's being used as a commercial site or a residential site. They set, different standards. So they're kind of separate.
But the same in a way.
Yeah. But you can separate the two out.
Yes.
Level of involvement of humans on that land, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you would quantify that, because if you're being overly zealous, this may sound silly, breathing is hazardous to human health. So if you get overly zealous about this whole thing, then we may end up nothing being consented or anything. So I'm just, I know it's a bit far-fetched, but sometimes as humans, we do get a little bit far-fetched over things, and go too far in risk mitigation. That's all I'm trying to.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember, panel, was that PDP is not introducing any new rules. All the rules are those that are deemed rules from the NES. So, and deemed on every district plan in the country. All it's doing, or what it's doing, is changing the policy and objective framework. So as to help inform the assessment of those consents. And it's tended to borrow words from the title of the NES itself, which is, where is it? Should know it off by heart. Talks about human health though, doesn't it? Yes, National Environmental Standard for Assessing and Managing Contaminants in Soil.
Yeah.
Okay. To protect human health. Yeah. 2011. So any activity that affects soil, something
that's the qualifier.
Yeah.
In soil. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Probably the way we're going to see planning undertaken in the future through these series of NESs, national standards. But who knows? Okay, last and finally, hazardous substances.
Would you like me to read from chapter 2? Or I'm happy to go from
Section 2.
Here it comes.
section.
Here it comes.
We're just getting it. Thank you. The answer is yes.
Thank you, Rick.
Oh, hang on. I need to get one as well. Sorry.
Would help.
Yes. All right. The use of hazardous substances in New Zealand is primarily managed by the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, Health and Safety at Work Act, and relevant regulations. The introduction to the Hazardous Substances chapter within the Operative District Plan notes the Resource Management Act provisions are to be seen in conjunction with the requirements of the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, which is a primary statute control of hazardous substances. controls under HASNO cannot be negated or reduced by district plan requirements. The operative district plan contains controls on the storage and use of hazardous substances. Whether the storage of or use of hazardous substances are permitted, controlled, or discretionary depends on the receiving zone and whether certain standards are met relating to site design, layout, drainage, spill containment, waste management, and storage of radioactive materials.
So a typical example would be a service station with underground tanks, containing petrol or diesel, or which would be classified as a hazardous substance.
Yes.
And depending on the zone, there would be certain standards to be met relating to, containment and all of those sort of things. Yep. And there would be, you could go to district plan or HASNO and work out what they are.
Yep.
Yeah, and you could get a certificate under the HASNO Act if required.
Yep.
Okay.
The activity status is designed to reflect the level of risk.
Yes.
The district plan review found the following key issues with the operative approach to managing the storage of hazardous substances. The rules and standards duplicated requirements and regulations under the HASNO Act and Health and Safety at Work Act. The duplication results in inefficiencies and unnecessary compliance costs. The operative plan does not manage new sensitive activities locating near significant hazardous facilities, potentially resulting in incompatibility issues and risk.
Can you give us an example of 6B?
So it wouldn't manage if someone was to put a dwelling, this is probably quite relevant, but if someone was to put a dwelling in close proximity to a hazardous facility, it wouldn't manage that sort of thing, being a new dwelling as a sensitive activity. The operative approach to managing hazardous substances was based on the quantity and hazard classification of hazardous substances on a site, which, depending on the level of compliance with certain quantities, would then trigger a higher activity. This approach entirely replaced by an approach based on specific activities which use, manufacture, store, or dispose hazardous substances defined as significant hazardous facilities. Through the draft district plan, the rules required resource consent for any new significant hazardous facility. Setbacks were also proposed for sensitive activities from existing significant hazardous facilities. The proposed district plan approach to managing hazardous substances is in managing the risks or the effects not specifically managed by other legislation on hazardous substances. The proposed provisions focus on land use issues associated with significant hazardous facilities, such as their location and proximity to sensitive activities and sensitive environments. The hazardous substances chapter contains 2 objectives and 2 supporting policies. A rule framework follows that looks at managing the risk to people, property, and the environment from any significant hazardous facility. A key difference between the 2 approaches is that a new significant hazardous facility or additions to an existing facility do not have the opportunity to be assessed against permitted activity standards, and there are no permitted, controlled, or restricted discretionary rules. The intention behind this approach was to remove the duplication of assessing the quantity and type of substances being stored, which is already managed under other legislation. Rather, the PDP focuses on managing the residual risk associated with these activities through undertaking a risk assessment and managing accordingly. In other words, the managing of the issues and effects such as the location of these facilities in relation to other activities and the environment, such as water bodies.
Struggling might be the long morning, but trying to understand what is the key difference between the PDP and the ODP. Say, is that a new significant hazard facility or additions to do not have the opportunity? Are you talking about the ODP or the PDP there in your first and second line?
So under the proposed district plan, there's no permitted, controlled, or restricted discretionary rules.
Okay.
Any new significant hazardous facility that
At all?
No, they're automatically discretionary, I believe.
It's okay. So he's,
So
SFA is discretionary.
yes, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I could have made that more clear.
That's okay. So help the panel out. What's the typical SFA? Is there a definition?
Yes, there is a definition.
Sorry, not SFA, SHA, is it?
A significant,
Is it SHF?
yes, there's a definition. I could get that up and read it if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be good to know what we're dealing with.
One second. So just to highlight, this has been,
Hang on, are you sharing your screen?
oh no, I wasn't sharing my screen.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Looks significant.
It's a lovely backdrop, isn't it? Look,
Yeah.
I thought it's right in the middle of the forest there.
Has it preferred it?
Yeah, I thought it was
Not bad.
good to, right, thank God.
Thank you.
That one?
Is this a brand new definition?
Yes, I don't think we had this in the operative plan.
Okay.
Get it all in there.
So in my section 42A, I recommended that this be changed as a result of submissions because the lines following from I all the way down shouldn't be.
It should be A, B, C, D.
Yes.
Yeah. Gotcha. But that was just a formatting change.
Yeah, just, yeah.
So essentially it's a listing technique. So if you're in between A and whatever X becomes, you're one of those activities, you're automatically a significant hazardous facility.
Yeah.
And you go straight to discretionary activity statement.
Yes.
Okay.
Just on those storage amounts,
Hmm.
you've got 100,000 litres, is that enough for some of these bigger fuel companies? I suppose it is, 100,000 litres.
Is that at the standard tank?
I can find that out.
Can you find out the same with that LPG? Because 6 tons I thought was possibly a little bit light.
Mm. Is that for the tank?
I've-
Oh, no.
I can find that out.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there anything after X?
Yes.
Oh, the list goes on.
Can you just explain how a milk treatment plant would be hazardous?
I can also find that out for you.
What would be useful is how's this list being derived?
I think some of it has come from the operative plan. I'll need to double check where that's come from.
If you could.
Yeah.
Just tell us the story in your reply. It's probably in your 42A already, but just
Yeah.
respond in your reply as to where you derived this definition from, and maybe just compare it to some of the more recent district plans like the Hutt City one.
Because I'll just give an example with that fuel thing. A truck and trailer unit's probably only going to show up with about 40,000 litres.
Mm.
It's quite a,
Mm.
it'd be about right. Truck and trailer would be 40,000.
I probably know too much, but 100,000 is about the standard UHT for underground tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll typically put in 2 tanks and they can separate the tank out into different octanes internally.
Mm.
But they'll have a different tank for diesel and a different tank for petroleum.
So that 100,000 is not specific to each type of fuel. It's one big tank in total.
Yeah, well, if you just go up, could you scroll up there? And there's different volumes for diesel and petrol, yeah.
Same.
So, yeah, so 91, 95, 98 would all be, would be subject to a cap of 100,000 litres. And, but diesel would be, yeah, that's quite high in my experience. But I'm not giving evidence.
But if you read in the submissions, no one is opposed to, none of the fuel
Yeah.
companies have opposed it, so.
Yeah.
It must be,
But just knowing how it's been derived, how you've packed it together and how it compares to, I mean, the most latest plan is the Hudson one. It was just quite a couple of weeks ago. Well, a couple of months ago, sorry.
And probably the lower down ones from X down would probably be the amount of chemical that was associated with those businesses that was kept on site,
Yeah.
different chemical, I would think.
Okay, so there's an inclusive, there's an inclusive component to the list and there's an exclusive component. So that's presumably, sorry, if you can just scroll down again, please. Yeah, so it's the following are not considered to be. Okay.
Obviously, servos, yeah.
And what's G? Temporary military training activities.
You're on site.
Training instruction planes, okay. H is an interesting one, isn't it? Given that.
Yeah, but that's covered off under a dangerous goods license. Because if you don't DG for a truck, there is a very specific way you load things, trying to eliminate.
So the question there is there potential duplication between clause H and the dangerous good? Which trying to get rid of some duplication. So is that inadvertently adding or repeating the duplication?
It is just for the avoidance of.
Oh, so that's not. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yep, understood. It is definitely getting.
They are not.
Okay. And is sensitive activity defined in this section? Given that that's the. As it's right.
No, not that one.
That's it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, that was it.
No, that was the one up. Sensitive here. Okay. Again, just a derivation of those lists and how it compares to other recent examples, good practice. Yeah, as I said, it's probably in your 42A already, but getting it won't hurt. Okay. Where are we?
Number 3, matters raised in submissions. Yes. Total of 33 original submission points were received, which in 9 submissions on the hazardous substances topic, and 1 further submission. Of the submission points, the majority were in the chapters objectives, policies, rules, and standards. 1 submission sought to HAS 01B, and 1 sought a change to rule HAS R2. 1 sought an amendment to the definition of significant hazardous facility, which I described earlier.
Okay.
As set out in the Section 42A report on this topic, it was recommended the changes to, so significant hazardous facility be accepted, results in the amendment of the numbering. The Middle Wellington Fish and Game sought an amendment to HAS 01B to use stronger wording than the term minimised to be more directive in responding to the drinking water value of the entity. I recommended this submission point be rejected for reasons set out in the Section 42A report.
Just for Bronte's benefit, it's a cross-link reference to the minimise issue that Dr. Dorr raised, where the term minimise hasn't recommended for adoption here. 14.
Submitter Enviro NZ Services sought an amendment to HAS R2 to require new sensitive activities to obtain resource consent as a non-complying activity if located within 500 metres of a significant hazardous facility rather than the 250 metre distance proposed in the PDP. I also recommended this submission point be rejected for reasons set out in that report. I have read the relevant effective evidence of Thomas Turia for BP Oil New Zealand and Karen Rosser for it. I acknowledge that Mr. Turia accepts the recommendations outlined in the Section 42A report. At the time of writing the summary statement, no expert evidence was received from Wellington Fish and Game, and they don't look to be speaking to their submission at this hearing. I've looked again and it looks like they're still not presenting today.
Yes.
I have therefore listed their relief as an matter of contention in the summary. I respond to the expert evidence of Karen Rosser on behalf of Enviro NZ Services below. Ms. Rosser states that Enviro Services NZ Limited sought an amendment to rule HAS R2 to increase the distance that sensitive activities must be from a significant hazardous facility from 250 metres to 500 metres. In the Section 42A report, I recommended this be rejected and noted the following. A distance of 250 metres was an arbitrary distance based on a common distance for this purpose used in other plans, such as the New Plymouth District Plan, Operative South Taranaki District Plan, proposed Timaru District Plan, and the proposed Gore District Plan.
Maybe if you just update that list to reference the Hutt City plan too.
But I had not provided any evidence that a 500 metre separation distance is more appropriate than a 250 metre distance. 500 metres being a considerable distance that may be disproportionate to the level of risk from hazardous facilities, making otherwise permitted activities non-complying. For example, a dwelling in the general residential zone that would otherwise be permitted could become non-complying. As set out in the evidence from Ms. Rosser, she disagrees with the recommendation I have made to retain the 250 metre distance. I acknowledge that the submitter seeks that the district plan provide protection to significant hazardous facilities and notes that evidence is specifically related to landfills for their operation and especially in relation to reverse sensitivity. The setback applies to all types of significant hazardous facilities, with landfills being one type of facility. In my opinion, there is variability in the scale and nature of significant hazardous facilities, which in turn influences the nature and magnitude of adverse effects and the degree to which they can internalise their adverse effects. The purpose of this setback is twofold, as set out in policy HAS P2. So number one, not exposing sensitive activities to unacceptable level of risk, i.e. risk of fire or explosion from the use or storage of hazardous substances. And two, avoiding or mitigating reverse sensitivity effects, i.e. noise, odour from the hazardous facility. The focus of the evidence by Enviro NZ is on the second purpose relating to reverse sensitivity. I've referred to the Winston Aggregates versus Matamata Piako District Council case, being a key case on reverse sensitivity, which considered buffer zones, setbacks, the proposed district plan around intensive farming sites and other activities, i.e. quarries and industrial activities. The court set out a range of principles concerning reverse sensitivity and when restrictions on surrounding properties may be appropriate.
I think we can probably take those three. I think we came across those.
These are good.
Section one, when Mr. Robertson entered on definition of reverse sensitivity. I think you ended up recommending the Kiwi Rail or Hort.
Yeah, it was the Kiwi Rail. I can jump back in.
Yes, yeah, we're familiar with that case. Yeah.
Also not aware of any currently operating landfills in the Wairarapa apart from potentially a few dumps on farms which would not be classified as landfills. I understand there are a few closed landfills which the setback would not apply to. Waste transfer stations are not significant hazardous facilities, therefore the setback would not apply to them. In this context, it is difficult to apply the above principles in the absence of any operating landfills. If a landfill was to establish in the future, as noted in Principle 2B above, its anticipated newly established activities would internalise their effects. Noting the above, I retain my existing position that 250 metres is sufficient and an appropriate separation distance before a new sensitive activity becomes non-complying. Noting the context of landfills, that there is no operating landfills in the Wairarapa, and if any new one were established, the activity would first have to meet the regulations set out in the relevant acts, and then would require resource consent under the district plan as either a discretionary or a non-complying activity, where the appropriateness of the location would be assessed.
With Bronte's help, can you bring up the rule that deals with sensitive activities and the hazardous substances?
Chapter. So,
Your evidence or?
yeah, you can, this one to make evidence would work. So it's just pull up that one there.
This one?
Yep.
Just while she's doing that, this is a brand new rule, isn't it?
Yes.
There's no equivalent in the operative plan.
No.
Which role?
Down. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Go straight to non-complying.
Yes.
What's the policy?
Oh.
Avoidance. Me too. Okay. Can you just, is this all zones? Two, is that all zones? Okay. And could we go back to, no other guidance, no assessment matters or?
Just go back to an unacceptable level of risk.
Okay. Take us back to the definition of sensitive activity, significant hazardous facility.
Find it.
Just while Bronte's looking for that, how many submissions were there in relation to Rule 2 and Policy 2?
Might need to just look at my section 42, but I think it's just that one. There was some that.
Yeah.
We had couple in support,
Yeah,
and this is the only one that opposed.
and it's seeking more strenuous.
Yes.
Take us to the section 32 report on this.
Yes. How do I get there?
That'll be
Right. Yes.
The section 32 report.
yeah. And on sensitive activities, where's it talked? Where's the assessment of this new policy and rule?
Yeah.
I want to do a word search for sensitive.
Yeah, so that was found as a key issue that needed to be addressed.
Yeah, just take it slowly. Okay, so you sensitive. Manage, yes, okay. Next.
And then it
Now
looks
just so
plans.
there's other plans. 250, yes.
The evaluations on page 24.
Yes, I
Thank
just,
you.
but we'll just, yeah, thank you. We'll just get there. Just keep going through. Yep,
Keep going.
250, yeah. Yep. Yes. 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 Would, yes. Okay, yes. Okay. Panel just direct your attention to bullet point 4 on that table at the bottom. Were you involved in the 32? No. Okay. Are there any metrics to back up the term don't create unjustifiably high costs on the community? So,
No, not that I know of.
okay, you keep on trucking through. We'll get to page 24 in a minute. Hang on.
Where I was, I think.
Okay, benefits. Okay, keep going. Oh, is that it? Yeah, 24.
Nearly.
Oh. Okay, page 25. Okay, that's one. Is that, oh. One of my bugbears is not carrying across header rows on tables.
Do you want me to scroll up again?
Yeah, just to remind us what the header cost benefit, okay, cost benefit, right, yeah. It's a simple technique. So this is the rule on the receptor to the hazardous. So the rule is non-complying for any sensitive activity locating within 250 metres of a listed
Yes,
facility.
for that one specifically, but there is the rule, policy P1, I think. No, sorry, there's another rule.
Yeah.
It does say that it's got to drop down new hazardous.
Yeah, but that's the control of the hazardous facilities.
Yeah.
Is that, but that's not a proximity issue, is it?
Well, if a new hazardous facility is being located within 250 metres of it, it flips it.
Okay. Okay. Need to think further on that. Is that it? Yeah, keep going. Right. Yeah, and right. It could just take us to rule 1 then.
There's no change, so you can, yep, hazardous. So this isn't the one being submitted on, but this one R1. It's discretionary, but if it's located within 25 metres of a significant, 250 of a sensitive activity.
It's the flip.
Yes.
Okay.
Goes to non-compliant.
Is the intention that there is an existing sensitive activity? Of course,
It's, yeah,
it has to be existing, doesn't it? Because
Conditions.
significant hazardous facilities, including additions.
oh, sorry, I phrased that question badly. If the significant hazard facility or addition to it, if it becomes a non-complying activity, it would have to be located within 250 metres of an existing, i.e. known sensitive.
Yes.
So not some future proposed one because that's unknown, but
Yeah.
but the converse of that is if a future sensitive activity seeks to establish within 250 metres of an existing hazardous facility, it would require a non-complying activity state.
Yes.
Also. Okay. If that's rule 1, just quickly look at rules 2 and 3.
It's just rule 2.
Rule 2. Again, that's an existing significant hazardous facility. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Some food for thought there, but not a lot of scope to do anything about it.
No.
Just as a general comment, I don't mean to be critical, but there's a lot of weasel words in that section 32 report. They're not that bespoke to the issue. When you're talking about costs, the panel really expects a more detailed assessment of what's this effectively a paradigm shift in the rules, bringing in. It's one thing to say that these are done by other councils, but it's another thing to actually say what the impact of this is on the community. And I'm thinking thinking of the firefighting water standard control when I say that, which was a new rule suggested through a submission as opposed to the notified plan. And we got there in the end in terms of 52. Yeah, I'm just seeing some red flags here, but looks like there's very little scope to deal with it. I mean, what I'd really like you to do, and I don't know if it's possible, is to put some rings on some sensitive existing highly sensitive facilities, and with the 250 metre radius and around the townships, just to see how they intersect with residential and commercial.
I could do that. I'll have a look through and see if I have anything. I'd had a little look at if we did have any hazardous facilities under the old plans, and there was only one, and that was Mitre 10, and that was in 2008, I think.
Walking on a service station will be a hazardous facility if it's got.
Oh yeah, I was looking at what needed resource considered.
Yeah, I can talk about existing hazardous facilities. We've got policies in the district plan that encourage intensification in Masterton, for example.
Yeah.
It's the only district that has the medium density zone, I think, residential zone. So Masterton might be a good example of plotting existing HSFs, highly SHS, significant hazard facilities from that list, drawing the 250, because the sensitive activities aren't just residential activities, are they?
No. They're education and
childcare facilities. Yeah.
And you can think in your mind now, you can start to draw circles and think, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an academic exercise because the panel in the absence of any scope challenging this, and it looks like the scope is really supporting the rule and or seeking it to be widened.
Mm.
So, okay,
That's applying the 250 metre.
yeah. End of sermon. Okay, 12:20. Panel, anything further?
No, that's good.
Okay. Well, that was good. That was a good session this morning. We'll break now for 40 minutes and we'll come back and hear from Mr. Duncan
Yeah.
at 1 o'clock.